I am delighted today to be joined by my friend and frequent collaborator, Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hello, Mark. Pleasure to be here with you online.
We get together to talk about ideas sometimes, but also to do what we call a philosophy slam. And I'll put some details in the notes below about that. It's essentially improvisation around ideas and themes called out by an audience. But we also have a great interest in psychotherapy, both individually and in terms of groups, even societally. And Robert, it was that I was hoping we might talk about today, because it feels like there's a huge interest in psychotherapy in our culture. Of course, that's been noted for decades now. But maybe we're reaching a time where people are really asking this question of what is good therapy and what is bad. Big celebrities pop up routinely in newspapers talking about therapy, some saying it helped, some saying it didn't. I've also been very struck by this idea of trauma as a very sort of baggy, it feels, catch-all for all kinds of difficulties that people might face. And whilst I don't doubt that people do suffer traumas, I wonder whether we've reached, you might call it even peak trauma. It's starting to lose some of its power because it's so widely used. But this sense, maybe we need to ask again what therapy is and what its goals are. That's something which makes some sense to you as well.
Yeah, it does. And I think you're right. I mean, it's in the culture now in a way that's more prevalent maybe than ever before. If I think about certainly in my sort of professional lifetime, the idea of being in therapy. I remember the very first time, I went to consult a psychotherapist. I was in my 20s. I'm in my late 50s now. And then, the idea of seeing a psychotherapist was, that's that's like a bit mental health, isn't it? That's a bit weird. Are you mad? Are you crazy? Or whereas now it's not only in the culture, it's almost a kind of badge of honor. I'm going to see my therapist. And you talk about our culture. I think we've talked about this informally. There's our culture, which is, I don't know, broadly Anglophone, but within that, I think there is a kind of let's call it for shorthand a more an American version, or certainly Californian version, as well as a more, let's call it, British version. I know these labels are a bit, well, very crude, but once we start talking about American therapy, and not, of course, not all American therapy is bad and British therapy is good, not at all. But, you mentioned celebrities, immediately comes to mind Harry and Meghan, and, celebrities who will have a therapist almost as a kind of what seems to be, and this may be an unfair judgment, but seems to be a kind of lifestyle thing. Like you have a therapist, like you'd have a yoga teacher or something like that. Maybe that's fine. But it does play to your point, I think, which is the sheer prevalence and popularity of therapy these days. So I think I completely agree with that. On peak trauma, I mean, it's a striking phrase because, of course, at a certain level, we don't want people to be reaching trauma of any kind. So we do hope it's peaked. But I think what you're describing there is not peak trauma per se, but peak claim of trauma, peak saying there is trauma, whether there is or not. And in some cases, I'm sure it's entirely valid, but in other cases, it might be something less traumatic than what people are describing it as. I mean, actually, Mark, maybe one way into this, speaking of good and bad therapy, would be for us to think about what we think a good definition of trauma might be and what a bad definition of trauma might be. I don't know if that's interesting to you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think the reason why it struck me is because trauma tends to bring with it the idea of healing or being relieved or sort of freed from your trauma. And clearly, that may be a very good thing in very many cases, particularly coming out, say, of the kind of PTSD that arises from warfare. The relationship between psychotherapy and warfare has a deep history because Freud saw people who came back from the wars at the First World War and before, and wondered why they kept visiting in dreams, say, the traumatic things that had happened, and being repeatedly tormented by what had happened. It didn't seem to have any benefit. And that, in a way, I think offers a good definition of trauma, which is when someone has become so trapped by something that's happened that they are tormented by it, and with the best will in the world feel trapped. But it feels that also what that can miss is the kind of experience in life which undoubtedly is difficult, but rather than assuming what you need is a kind of release from it in order to return to some sort of social norm, what might be happening is that there's something more complicated going on, that what is difficult in life is actually posing the question to you of, is there a wider life, a more expansive, maybe less individual, maybe less tied to the past, maybe as well one in which it's sort of resisting the myth of progress in our culture, with the sort of the healing assumption that technology will make things better, that we can hope and aspire for almost anything in life and ideally will achieve it as well. That troubles can be saying to us, look, there might be vulnerabilities, limitations, frailties, which are part and parcel of life. The vast majority of people encounter these forms of suffering at some point, but rather than treating them as that which you should ideally be free of, but if they do come to you, get over them, asking you, have you misunderstood something about life itself, and that suffering, vulnerability, frailty, limit needs to be accepted in order that then a different kind or quality of participation in life might be discovered. That might have the benefit that instead of being so self-reliant, you are compelled initially because of suffering to turn to others, but actually then that participating in life more broadly with others, with other dimensions of life as well, with the dead, with ancestors, with other ecologies of being in which we live, that in a hyper-individualistic culture we've sort of lost touch with. To put it another way and then hand it back, I'm always struck that in many wisdom and religious traditions, suffering goes together with enlightenment, or death and life are seen as part of a whole. And it feels that the automatic turning to trauma with the assumption of healing perhaps is missing something really profound that up until recently has always been regarded as actually important, not just something to get over.
It's absolutely fascinating what you're saying, Mark, particularly the link that you talked about at the end there between suffering and enlightenment. I'm going to go back to something you said really near the beginning, though, that about, in fact, you used the word repeatedly at one point in relation to trauma. Why do people repeatedly re-experience trauma, as it were? And you also refer to Freud, and as you know, I'm very interested in Freud. Freud more or less says we repeat what we don't understand, and trauma gets repeated because we never understood the thing that happened to us in the first place. What made the trauma traumatic is that we couldn't process it. You talked about warfare. We were in a war. It was so overwhelming that we simply didn't have the mental or emotional faculties to process it at the time. And therefore it kind of spills over, and we try to process it again and again and again through dreams, nightmares, or through other displaced forms of behavior, which are, as it were, symptoms of that trauma. But that's what makes the trauma traumatic, that we repeat it without understanding it in an attempt to understand it, and therefore tame it in some way. So for me, that is a pretty good definition of trauma. It's not a bad thing that happened to me that I still feel sad about or upset about or angry about or whatever. It's not in that cognitive mode of, my father was a bully and, I hate him. It gets us at a deeper level. Once you can describe trauma in a very eloquent way. In a way, it's no longer trauma. It's, or it's trauma when it's very compressed and oblique and difficult and painful. And I wouldn't be surprised, Mark, in the kind of practicing psychotherapeutic work you do, whether when people are genuinely dealing with trauma, it's actually the least easy thing to articulate of all. And that's when people fall silent and cry or whatever. So for me, a little, I suppose a kind of very basic test would be of whether something is traumatic is the degree of coherence that the person can bring to it when they're describing it. So just, in answer to the question, what's a good definition of trauma? Maybe the old Freudian definition isn't a bad one. Trauma is what we repeat because we don't understand.
Yeah, I know. I very much like that, and the understanding there is meant in, as I understand it anyway, in the most sort of commodious sense that it's that which we sort of almost can't feel our way around or feel our way into, because it has this quality, as you're saying, of being so kind of compressed, so dark. I mean, maybe lost to memory even.
Yeah,
that can happen, of course.
Yeah, it makes me think also. I mean, you talked about the limits that we all have in the world, and that in a way we can learn as much from those limits as we can through trying to dispel them or trying to alleviate or soothe or salve our suffering in order to get to a kind of perfect, unblemished state. It made me think that actually there is another, and again, sort of Freud hints at this. I've been thinking quite a lot recently about an essay by him called Creative Writers in Daydreaming, which he wrote very little, surprisingly, about this theme, although he did write a lot about art and literature and so on. But basically what he says is that, all of art and creativity comes from repressed material. Now, if I put words in Freud's mouth, as it were, and extrapolate from there, you could say trauma is what you can't explain in everyday language. But trauma is what can come out in displaced forms like artworks, like poems, like dreams, which for Freud are versions of artworks and vice versa. And it might be another way in which actually trauma has a precious quality for us too. It's precisely in the non-dispelling of it or the non-alleviating of it that we find something surprising. I mean, I wonder how many artworks we'd have today, if we had completely non-traumatized artists. Now, of course, that, I can imagine people saying, oh, right, you want everybody to have a traumatic childhood so that we can have good art. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But it is interesting, another way of talking, another direction in which to maybe to take what you're saying about the value that there sometimes is in suffering, or the value in meeting the limits that we find in our lives, the value we have in not always being happy, can also be found in things like acts of creativity, where creativity comes from a well of what's not understood even by the person who's creating it. I don't know, when I've had goes at writing creatively, and I'd be very surprised if this weren't the case for proper artists or creative writers. I'd be very surprised if they understood everything they were producing, and if they were, I'd be a bit suspicious of it in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to complement the Freudian idea there with the Jungian take, because Jung has this idea that dreams, the creative side to us, is not just about what might be repressed, but might be part of our psyche that's calling us forward. So it's not just about dealing with the past, but is leading us into a wider future. And so a dream would be either a shadow notion, another quite widely used idea here now that for some reason or other is unpalatable. It may be due to personal experience. It may actually be due to cultural sanctioning as well. But because Jung has this porous notion of what we're unconscious of, i.e. it's not just personal, but comes from our shared inheritance through family, through time and place. that too can press in on us unconsciously and precipitate creative output to try and explore that, which can be traumatic or trauma-like in the exploration of, precisely because it's asking us not just to be imaginative, but really press to the limits of what we know and move into a much less certain place. And Jung has this idea that whenever the unconscious and the conscious parts of ourselves sort of meet in an active way, that tends to stir up feeling. It's one of the ways in which we know that we're engaging with something bigger than just what our conscious minds can grasp. And so again, it maybe not invariably, but it's often going to feel difficult and maybe involve long periods of struggle and uncertainty. And maybe that's a quality that creative people can tolerate, is living with the unknown, perhaps for quite some time, but because they trust that it's productive ultimately. And that's a capacity that they have to be able to manage and have a way of life that supports. And that, because that's another facet that I wonder about a lot, is how much does our culture support these things? Where are the communities where struggle and difficulty and the desire to not just continue on a projected path of progress, as technology, for example, is often talked about, but really discover radically different possibilities in life, more associated perhaps with conversion or transformation, transcendence? These kind of ideas come to mind. And whilst a lot of people might say they're interested in that, the dominant culture, strangely, is rather conservative about the future. I often think we feel very concerned about the future and is it going to turn out good or bad, but it's in often very limited ways that we imagine the future, for better or worse. We don't seem to be able to hold open the places where a very different kind of kairos, different kind of time might emerge. So have we become sort of enamored with the predictions of our own success?
And there's a lot in what you're saying there, Mark, particularly about this idea of kind of progress and a sort of idealized version of the future that sort of removes all blemishes from it. And I can't help thinking it's sort of part and parcel with this idea that somehow we'd be able to get rid of death one day, that we could get rid of trauma, we could get rid of all suffering and get rid of pain, we could get rid of death. And everything that goes into the kind of negative column, as it were, is just an aberration or an anomaly that over time will gradually erode and just be left with the kind of asset or positive column. But I'm still turning over what you said right at the beginning still, about this notion of suffering enlightenment, such an interesting idea. And and of course, we don't want to promote suffering. We don't want people to suffer, of course, and it would be ridiculous as a position. But I think catching up, I suppose, with what you're saying there, yes, there is that tradition, and you'll know far more about this than I will, in the spiritual tradition, which is about, for example, self-denial or asceticism, fasting, prayer, meditation, all of these things, pilgrimage, all of these things, in a way, are versions of not delivering immediate gratification, or not simply embracing pleasure or sensuous pleasure or physical or cognitive pleasure, because they themselves appear to be roots into something which is not necessarily kind of, better or worse necessarily, but certainly kind of deeper than happiness, deeper than non-trauma, I suppose. So that's sort of how I'm beginning to hear what you're saying anyway in that, which is interesting, because I suppose the model therefore is, if in bad therapy there is a model which says, oh no, you've got trauma, let's fix you, or really bad therapy, which is, oh no, you've got trauma, that must be terribly bad, you're a victim, I'm going to corroborate your story, which I think is an even more degraded version of that. maybe the alternative, and I think perhaps what I'm hearing you say in this is, okay, there is trauma, but that forms part of a suite of other experiences that humans have, which too lazily we might put in the suffering column. But along with things like self-denial, asceticism, and all those other practices, which give us access to something we otherwise might never have experienced, which is the kind of, yes, let's call it enlightenment, for want of a better word, but where enlightenment isn't necessarily a state of, happiness. It is something quite different from that. As my understanding, at least, if we were to come on to that, would be that enlightenment is maybe a state of consciousness, for sure, but consciousness doesn't mean all is good all of the time. And in fact, it can be a consciousness of things which are difficult and problematic and which don't fit a kind of simple univocal narrative of the positive, the happy, the sunlit uplands of humanity or whatever.
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying of Krishnamurti, who, when he was about to die, was asked by his followers for a final thought or comment, and everyone sort of waited for the great revelation. And he apparently replied, "I don't mind what happens." And so that's not saying, I'm about to sail off into eternal happiness. It's precisely saying that, life can throw all sorts of things at you, and yet somehow you found maybe a level of being that can say yes to whatever happens in life. Like you're suggesting, in terms of, we're not advocating suffering here, and my version of that is always feeling a bit cautious and nervous talking about suffering, because it's sort of, be careful what you pray for. Suffering is suffering, and there's absolutely no doubt that at times it really does destroy lives, not just be part of a path to another appreciation of life. And so, just to say that again, we're not saying there's no such thing as trauma here. We're trying to tease into a wider sense of it. But another way of putting it perhaps is, in religion, there's certainly in Christianity, there's this idea of the problem of suffering, which is, how can a good God have created a world in which there's suffering? And in fact, the really intense version of the question is not just where there's suffering, but when there's so much suffering, because it's also the case that some people just suffer too much, and it's hard to rationalize away at all just because of sheer quantity, extent. But that noted, at the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, my sense is that it's actually in suffering that people often turn to God or turn to religious traditions, maybe because they can offer practices or community that are supportive, but also because it's in those moments that the biggest questions become undeniable and completely pressing, and whatever it is that you've turned to prior to that point just isn't enough. And maybe it's partly a tradition that can give expression to the horror and the injustice, the indignity, and the why, but hold out the possibility that there is a response, if not quite a direct answer, which is why people do turn to God when things become too much. And so that, again, that's maybe putting this link somehow between death and life. In Christianity, Good Friday comes before Easter Sunday, death comes before resurrection, and even Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, I don't pretend to understand that, and as I say, feel nervous about even talking about it, but nonetheless, it feels like there is something really worth trying to stay open to in that link, if not fully understanding it.
I think at the back of my mind here is this question, which I think we're posing in these conversations we're having anyway, Mark, which is about good and bad therapy and what's therapeutic about therapy. And if I'm right, the etymology of the word therapy comes from a Greek word for nurse. I believe that's right. I could have that wrong. But the question is, what one can expect therapeutically from a therapist. You're a practicing therapist. I'm involved in constellations, which has therapeutic aspects to it. But I think it feels like there is a sense in which you can be therapeutic with somebody. You can offer therapeutic answers, solutions, ways forward, without sparing them from everything that's real in their life. And that's quite important, to leave reality in there, because reality is the thing in which there is the most learning to be had, I suppose, or something like that. So to be therapeutic actually isn't really to be particularly nurse-like necessarily. It's not to apply bandages and deliver painkillers. It's more to sit with somebody at their side and say, look, this is what happened. How do we make sense of it? So there's a sense-making aspect. And not just a sense-making aspect, but what can we learn from this thing? And conversely, just as the idea we learn from our mistakes, there's little to be learned from just being happy all the time. There's little benefit in just being innocent the whole time. There isn't any traction or give in any of that. There's no kind of grit in that oyster. So that's sort of going on in the back of my mind as we're talking here. And maybe you're right in the kind of, maybe there is something in the notion of religion as the openness to something that's bigger than us, to something which we can't master by ourselves, regardless of whether one's an atheist or not, but something in the idea of religion as an encounter with something other, different, greater, stranger, that makes us humble and forces us to learn, which is maybe where the link is between the religious and the therapeutic in that non-nurse type way of thinking about it. I don't know. I'm obviously improvising here a bit.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think that psychotherapy, it does mean something like waiting on the soul, or attending, nursing in that sense to the soul. And traditionally, at least, psychoanalysis has involved quite a monastic like routine, where the same time, same days of the week, maybe 5 days a week even, you see the same person, and that kind of pattern and rhythm mirrors a monastic way of life. And where the common element is perhaps that you are waiting on something that's greater than you, and you want to be held in that space. And so I think to be heard, to be understood, and even to have techniques to be able to get through the day is clearly important. And monastic life would have its analogues there as well. You don't just want to have a breakdown and be left in a complete state. I forget whether it was Wilfred Bion or Donald Winnicott, but one of those great British psychotherapists talked about going to pieces without falling apart. There is that sort of sense that breakdown can lead to breakthrough, put it like that. But nonetheless, you need a container, you need something to hold you, to be accompanied, and that has qualities of love and compassion and kindness, for sure, as well as insight and understanding.
It makes me want to ask you, and I'm conscious, maybe this is the last theme we talk about today, but we both have philosophical backgrounds here, and there's, what I'm hearing a little bit in what you're saying is a compatibility between versions of Stoicism and what you're describing in terms of learning from the limits in front of us, or learning from difficult material, or even the monastic in some way, has a sense of that, doesn't it? Once we're in a kind of monastic environment, we're in an environment where we can learn from what's difficult, what difficulty has. I mean, reminds me of that T.S. Eliot quote. He said, I think it was his notes on Lambeth. He was talking about the Lambeth conference in the, whenever it was, 30s or 50s. I can't remember exactly. But he talked about, whatever religion is, it has to be difficult. And of course, terribly unpopular thing to say, because the church at the time, millions times more than I do about this, Mark, but the church at the time trying to become more popular and reach out, and actually almost trying to say the opposite. No, religion's not difficult. It's easy, come and have fun. But there is a sort of stoical or stoicist strain in that as well, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, the reference to Stoicism is interesting because maybe this will be a future conversation, but it's another notion that's quite widely talked about, even in a more informed sense, not just the kind of, he's being stoical, stiff upper lip sense, but even with a sense that it involved practice and attending to your responses and that deeper notion of Stoicism. But what it feels to me often gets missed in modern Stoicism is what was present in ancient forms, which was attending to the divine, to the Logos. And so ancient Stoics would write hymns of praise to Zeus, and Seneca would talk about connecting with the wider divine presence in nature. And so there was that active attempt to engage with that which was more than yourself again, rather than just having some practices that help you to, find a way through trouble. Yes, look, we will draw to a close there now, but perhaps that's at least one strand of what's come out with this, considering good and bad therapy. I guess a shorthand way of putting it, again, it's probably a bit simplistic, but is it feeding into the hyper individualistic notion of our culture today, which brings that sense that one should be able to save oneself if only you can think about it right? And maybe that's part of what is being challenged with this notion of sort of culturally peak trauma. Do we need more to understand these things, not just referring to that quite so frequently? Anyway, look, thank you, teasing out those things. As ever, the improvisational element in a conversation always takes you to places that you don't quite expect, and do watch out for philosophy slams, details in the notes below, which Robert and I do as well. But look, Robert, thanks for now, and speak again.
Thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, until our next conversation. Thank you.